The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus says, "The Pharisees and the scholars have taken the keys of knowledge and hidden them. They themselves have not entered, nor have they allowed to enter those who wish to. You, however, must be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." Jesus says, "A grapevine has been planted apart from the Father. Since it is not strong, it will be pulled up by its roots and it will perish." Jesus says, "Those who have something in hand will be given more, and those who have nothing will be deprived even of the little they think they have." Jesus says, "Become passers-by." His disciples said to him, "Who are you to say these things to us?" Jesus said to them, "You do not understand who I am from what I say to you? Rather, you have become like the Judeans, for they love the tree but hate its fruit, or they love the fruit but hate the tree." Jesus says, "Whoever blasphemes against the Father will be forgiven, and whoever blasphemes against the Son will be forgiven. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven either on earth or in heaven." Jesus says, "Grapes are not harvested from thorn trees, nor are figs gathered from thistles, for they yield no fruit. Good persons produce good from what they've stored up inside. Bad persons produce evil from the wickedness they've stored up in their hearts and say evil things. For from the overflow of the heart they produce evil." The Gospel inspired by God. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. The President of Ireland is appointed by the Irish government for a term of 7 years, and the President may be reappointed for a second term. So in 1990, a woman called Mary Robinson was appointed the President of Ireland, and she was President from 1990 to 1997. And then in 1997, another woman called Mary McAleese was appointed President until 2004. And in 2004, Mary McAleese was reappointed for a second term. She's still President of Ireland. So in the last 20 years, the President of Ireland has been a woman. So about 2 years ago, I'm at home in Ireland, and I'm sitting in my niece's home with her son, called Isaac O'Sullivan. And we're watching television together. Now, she allows them to watch television maybe 2 hours in the week. And we're watching a program, and Mary McAleese is speaking. And the little kid is watching, sitting on the edge of his seat. He only sees TV maybe 2 hours a week. And he says to his mother, "Mammy, who's that?" And she said, "That's Mary McAleese. She's the President of Ireland." And the little fella says, "And how long has she been President?" And his mother says to him, "Well, she's been President since 1997, which was long before Isaac was born." And then he says to her, and who was the President before she was the President?" And his mother says, "It was a woman called Mary Robinson." And the little kid begins to think, and he says, "Mammy, are men allowed to be the President of Ireland?" So little children believe that the world into which they're born has always been like that. They can't believe that it ever had been different. Now, that was true for adults until fairly recently. The world we were born into, we presume that's the world that always existed. The world of politics or economics or whatever, the world we inherited, we all believed that was the world as it always was. But in recent times, it's getting more difficult to believe that, because even children of 10 realize that technologically speaking, the world that we're born into is no longer the world they're now experiencing. We have iPods and all kinds of stuff that even 10 years ago, little kids were not born to. But the thing which has changed maybe most glacially, perhaps, has been religion. And so a lot of us still believe that the religion we were born with has always been that version of religion. Or the gods we were brought up with, always that God has been worshipped. And nothing is further from the truth. When you take time to read the scriptural traditions of the world, and you look at the great religious texts, and you start digging archaeologically, and you look at the artifacts that are unearthed, then it becomes obvious really, really quickly that people have invented gods, they have hired gods, they have promoted gods, they have demoted gods, and they have fired gods more frequently than modern corporations hire and fire their CEOs. And this is really important news for a lot of people. We don't realize that. We presume that God, as we understand God, has always been God as has been understood by people. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I want to take that as a theme today. And I'm going to trace this theme. I'm going to call it the invention and the evolution of God. And I'm going to make 5 main points, basically. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the gods of the hunter-gatherers. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about the gods of the Sumerians. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the emergence of Yahweh, the God Yahweh. And then I'm going to take this text that Bob read for us today called the Hypostasis of the Archons. It's a big Greek jawbreaker, and I'll explain it to you as we come through it. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the God of Jesus. So I'll make 5 main points this morning. So the first one is the gods of the hunter-gatherers. Homo sapiens emerged about 200,000 years ago. So Homo sapiens literally means thinking people or wise people, but they still didn't have language. Language only came about 50,000 years ago with the next wave, which is called Homo sapiens sapiens. And Homo sapiens sapiens is different from Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens could think, but they didn't have language. Homo sapiens sapiens had language, which meant they could think about thinking. They could think abstractly, and they could begin to wonder and look for explanations for stuff. So the hunter-gatherers are typical of this period. So they're Homo sapiens sapiens, they have language, and they're trying to wrestle with the world in which they find themselves. And one of the first things they do is they invent gods. And they're doing this because they live in a world that they can't control. Not only can they not control it, they can't even predict it. They can't predict, they don't know the cycles of nature, they cannot predict it, they cannot control it, but at least they can begin to try to explain it. And so the first reason for gods was to try to foist some kind of an explanation on the phenomena of our experiences. We could not predict what was going to happen, we certainly could not control what was going to happen, but at least we could take a stab at explaining what's going to happen. And in the emergence of religion and civilization over the subsequent 50,000 years, we will try to move from explanations to predictions to control. That's the journey we think we're on. Whether it's hubris or chutzpah or not, that's the journey we've set ourselves. We think we can not just explain stuff, but we can predict stuff and maybe even ultimately control stuff. But the Bushmen of the Kalahari, have no pretense to that. They know they can't control, they know they can't predict, but at least they can begin to try to explain to themselves. And so the origin of religion and the origin of the gods is an attempt to try to explain the phenomena of our existence. That's the first reason why gods are invented. And so these people, these hunter-gatherers all over the world, they come up with explanations, and it always involves a multiplicity of deities. And they're trying to do this in order to understand the world in which they find themselves. And most importantly, they're trying to figure out, why do bad things happen? And the best explanation they can come up with, and to me it sounds like it's a really, really good, elegant, simple explanation. How can the bad things happen to good people? Because there's a multiplicity of gods who are constantly warring with each other, and when an ego gets bent, a bigger god crushes a smaller god. The smaller god has to vent his anger somewhere. He can't do it on the bigger god, so he vents it on human beings. It's a little bit like a mother chastises her son, little boy of 5, the child is not allowed to back chatter, so he goes in the backyard and he kicks the dog. So the first explanation for theodicy or the problem of evil was, it's the gods kind of venting their anger on us because we're weak and they can't vent it on gods who are bigger than them. It's a very elegant and a very simple explanation. It's hard to find a better one. And so they invented many gods, and this was their explanation. At some stage, as they move and they kind of collide with each other, at this stage of world history, the population of planet Earth is about 8 million people, comprising about 300,000 tribes whose average carrying capacity is somewhere between 25 and 40 members. So they're small little bands of nomads, hunter-gatherers, but at some stage they get larger and larger and they begin to bump against each other, and amalgamations happen, and now you're getting bigger and bigger and bigger tribes. So now you have need for a moral code. Hunter-gatherers, in a sense, have the simplest of all moral codes. It's basically just one precept. Basically, it's just cooperation. You don't need to say, don't steal. What are you going to steal? If you're hunter-gatherers and all you don't have clothes, you maybe have a knife that you're going to hunt with. You're going to steal somebody's knife. You're all sleeping together every night. You're all wandering. Where are you going to hide it? So there's no point in stealing anything because you can't hide it anyplace. And sexuality is free. So paternity is not an issue. So sexuality is not a problem here whatsoever. And telling lies, who are you going to tell lies to? You're living with people, you're sleeping with people, you're all in the same little area every night. What's the point of telling lies? It's going to be found out immediately. So morality was a very, very simple thing, consisting of just one precept, cooperation. Because you can't survive without cooperation. If I try to hide an antelope I've just killed and gorge myself on it, I have enough food for a day. I can't come back to it tomorrow because the hyenas are going to get it immediately, so I can't save it. I don't have a fridge. And so I'm going to starve for the rest of the week. So I find out very quickly, if I share my kill with the rest of them, somebody else will be lucky tomorrow and they'll share their kill with me. So cooperation is the only moral rule. But then, as you get bigger and bigger tribes and they live in different places, morality becomes very important. We have to now create some kinds of rules of engagement. Now it is possible to tell lies. Now it is possible to steal stuff from people. So we need some kind of a code of ethics. And so we now appeal to the gods and we claim divine authority for the rules we're going to make up. So this is the origin of moral thinking. So here are our tribal hunter-gatherer ancestors trying to make sense of their experience and trying to make sense particularly of why bad things happen. And then as they're growing more and more to try to make some kind of moral covenants with each other. So there's the evolution of the gods of the hunter-gatherers. After that then comes a different one. Out of nowhere, it seems, out of nowhere, 5,800 years ago, an extraordinary civilization just blossomed, ex nihilo. There was no precedent for it, there was no gradual lead up to it. A group called the Sumerians in Mesopotamia would be modern day Iraq. Out of nowhere, suddenly writing gets invented, mathematics gets invented, astronomy gets invented, high-rise buildings get invented, agriculture really moves forward very, very, very strongly, transport systems, ox-drawn plows, boats of all kinds, writing, temples, and religion. They all get invented all of a sudden out of nowhere. And they've left us hundreds of thousands of artifacts and scripts of various kinds that have been unearthed in the 1800s and the early 1900s. So we can understand exactly how this arose. And they're very, very clear. The Sumerians make no bones about it. They say, we didn't invent any of these things. We didn't invent math or astronomy or geometry or high-rise buildings or transport systems or religion or temples or writing. We didn't invent any of those. We got them, and this is in their writings, from an extraterrestrial society whom they called the Anunnaki. And they got a whole storyline about who these people were. And very, very simply, I'll recap it for you. The claim in these documents and these artifacts is that 445,000 years ago, a planet which they call Nibiru, which intersects with, it's part of our solar system, but it's in a huge elliptical orbit that visits our sun just once every 3,600 Earth years. So a single year for this planet would be 3,600 years for Earth orbits. So they call each of these 3,600 Earth years, they call it a SARS. And the claim was that 445,000 years ago, this planet ran into difficulties, atmospheric difficulties, and they needed gold dust to seed their own atmosphere to fix a hole in their, the equivalent of their ozone layer. Now it's interesting that we use dust particles in the windshields of our spacecraft. It's because it keeps out ultraviolet light and radiation. So they needed this according to the story of the Sumerians, and they discovered it on planet Earth. And they sent down a group of workers, about 500 people. And there were two leaders to the expedition. One guy called Enlil, who was in charge of governance, and the other guy called Enki, who was their chief scientist. And they landed in the Persian Gulf, and they began mining for gold in the waters. And they ran out of it very quickly, and they transferred their mining operation to South Africa. And now the gold was underground. It was much more difficult to extract it, but there was a lot more of it there. And so they labored on this for years and years and years and years, sending the gold dust back to Nibiru to repair the planet's atmosphere. But in the 300,000 years ago, so they're at this business for 150,000 years almost, and the workers revolt, say, you know what, this is backbreaking work, we're not going to do this anymore. And there's bedlam. And Enlil wants to punish them. But Enki says, no, I got a better solution. So they call their father, who lives on planet Nibiru. He's called Anu. And he comes down to Earth to adjudicate what are we going to do with these rebellious Anunnaki. And Enlil is in favor of punishing them. And Enki says, no, there's a much simpler solution to this. There are beings on this planet, humanoid type creatures, and I think I'm able to genetically moderate and genetically engineer their chromosomes so as to make them, good workers for us. They're the nearest thing to us on this planet, and I think we can just genetically engineer them very, very easily. And himself and his sister, who's called Ninti, and she's given the title Mother of Life. She's called Mami. The name Mami comes from this woman. She's their chief medical scientist, and her brother is their chief scientist. And they genetically engineered the first human, whom they call Adam, according to the Sumerian story. And they do it by taking eggs from the Anunnaki eggs from humanoid females, and cross-fertilizing them with seed from the Anunnaki men. And they impregnate Anunnaki women who hold these babies, and they deliver them by caesarean section. This is according to the texts. And they produce workers, a workforce. But these beings can't breed. They can't cross-fertilize. And so they have to tweak the design so that these human beings can now cross-fertilize and breed extra workers. And they use these workers in the mines, and then they prove to be fairly intelligent, so they now use them to cultivate their fields and grow their harvest for them. And they use them as domestic servants. And finally, because these creatures are very warlike and they're fighting constantly among themselves, they draft them into their military and they make soldiers of them. That's the Sumerian story. Now, at some stage, the Anunnaki male, and they were mainly male here, began to see that the human females were really, really attractive. So they began to take them as wives. And you find this in the Bible in chapter 6 of the book of Genesis, where it says, the sons of God found favor in the daughters of men, and they bred with them, and they created a nation of, the word used in the Bible is Nephilim, giants. And the gods themselves, the top echelon, were really, really upset. This was almost like bestiality, that they're crossbreeding with these creatures. They were really, really upset, and they decided to destroy the entire experiment. And they tried to wipe it out in a flood. But Enki tipped off a guy called Ziusudra. He'd be the equivalent of Noah. And they collected the DNA of all the species on the planet, and they put them into an ark, and they sealed the ark. And when the Anunnaki attempted to destroy all of civilization by creating an extraordinary tsunami, this boat survived, and therefore all the species survived. And finally the Anunnaki decided, you know what, it's time for us to leave, but we need to create an infrastructure. So then they began to teach us writing, and literature, orthography, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, building, transport, governance. They taught us marriage contracts. They made temples for us, and they taught us religion. And then they appointed a person they called Enmedoranki as the first interim governor between themselves and human beings. And then they handed over the reins of power. And we're living with the result. And we look like them, and we act like them. We make war with each other. We lie and we steal and we cheat and we kill, and we worship gods. And the gods we worship are the Anunnaki, for the simple reason that to us they look like gods. They seem to live forever. They live 3,600 times longer than we do. So they live up to 400 and 500,000 years of age. So as far as we're concerned, they're eternal. Moreover, they created us, and they totally rule us, and their technology way beyond ours. So when they finally departed, we remember them as sky beings, and finally this transmogrifies into God-like creatures. And so the religions of the world, in a sense, are the residue of that archetypal race memory. And you find it in every single tradition. You find this pantheon of gods. You find it in the Greek mythology, you find it in Celtic mythology, you find it in Roman mythology, you find it all over Africa. Everywhere people think about God, there's a pantheon of gods, and they're always sky gods, beings who came from the sky. So there's another further evolution. That's the second point then. From that then, I'm going to talk, my third point is about the emergence of this God we call Yahweh, whom we think is the head honcho. And we think that Moses was the first monotheist. Moses thrived about 1250 BC. Now, the vast bulk of modern Bible scholars do not believe Moses even existed, nor do they believe that there was an exodus out of Egypt in 1250 BC, where the Israelites, having seen plagues happen in Egypt, came out, led by God, and then came into the Promised Land and conquered the Promised Land. From the archaeological evidence over the last 100 years, it's increasingly obvious there was no Exodus, and very probably there wasn't a Moses. But somewhere around the year 1100 BC, a group of tribes in the southern part of Canaan began to migrate and bumped into a group in the north. and they entered into an alliance, and they began to share their pantheon of gods. And particularly from Ugaritic texts that have been unearthed in the last 100 years in the land of Palestine or Canaan, it's very obvious that the dominant pantheon of gods was headed by a god called El. And you find that sneaks into the Bible again and again. So the head god was El. Now a god called Yahweh was amalgamated with this group as a junior god. He became a son of El. And El divided up the property in the Middle East between his sons, and to his son now, Yahweh, he gave a particular piece of land, which we'd identify with modern Israel. But Yahweh was a very, very minor deity in a pantheon headed by El. But now history intervenes, as it always does. And in the year 721 BC, let me go back up a small bit before that. So King David, who survived and lived around the year 1000 BC, and his son Solomon, who died in 930 BC, they presided over a united kingdom which involved the southern tribes and the northern tribes, 12 of them together. But on the death of Solomon in 930, there was a civil war, and they divided again into two groups. The northern kingdom, which called itself Israel, 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom that called itself Judah, with 2 tribes. And in 721 BC, the northern kingdom was conquered by the great Assyrian Empire, and they're demolished. They're never heard of again. The southern kingdom survived for another 150 years, and this is the territory of Yahweh. So now the pantheon is gone, and Yahweh is the only survivor. And so by default, he's now the head god. But in the year 150 years later, in the year 589 BC, the Babylonian Empire, which has defeated the Assyrian Empire in the meantime, it conquers the land of Judah and takes the last 2 tribes into exile in Judah. Now it seems like their god, Yahweh, has been unable to the task. But it's interesting to see what they did with it. You would imagine now that Yahweh has been conquered, that's going to be the end of Yahweh. There was some extraordinary sleight of hand began to happen at this stage. Because now Yahweh started to claim the following stuff. He says, I used the gods of the Assyrians to punish the Israelites for not obeying my command. So not only am I not defeated, I'm actually in control of the God who defeated Israel. And I used the God of the Babylonians to defeat the Assyrians, and I used the God of the Babylonians to defeat Judah because Judah wasn't following my commands either. So now from being a God at the bottom of the pile who's being beaten into oblivion, Yahweh suddenly becomes the top God. He's the God who controlled the gods of the Assyrians. He's the God who controlled the gods of the Babylonians. And when the Persians overcame the Babylonians in the year 529, Yahweh is claiming that I controlled the God of the Persians as well. So now, by default, he's backed himself into a primacy position. Almost like what happened in Rome in 1871, when after 1,871 years of Christianity, finally the papacy backs itself into the position that it's infallible. It took us 2,000 years almost to figure that out. And it was a compensation that Pius IX offered himself for the loss of the secular papal states. This is how we find Yahweh as the only God. He's backed into it by sleight of hand and by historical circumstance. Which brings me to point number 4. This very complex reading that Bob did for us this morning. It's called in Greek the Hypostasis of the Archons. 2 big jawbreakers. Hypostasis literally just simply means the reality of, and Archons literally just means rulers. So the title of this is The Reality of the Rulers. And it's a document which came to light in 1945 as part of the Nag Hammadi Trove. But it dates back to the 3rd century. There was a whole bunch of books either destroyed or hidden in the year 367 when the great library in Alexandria was destroyed and all non-Christian writings or all Gnostic writings were destroyed. There was a whole bunch of stuff hidden. And it came to light in 1945, but the document goes way back to the 3rd century. And it is an exegesis or an explanation of the book of Genesis. It's an explanation of how the universe was created and how human beings were formed. And very, very simply, the story is this. There was a God and his consort, who we read today as she's called the female instructing principle. So the female instructing principle is the consort of God, or the feminine face of God, whichever way you want to look at it. And without consulting her helpmate, the male God, she created a bunch of creatures that are called demiurges, are called Archons. But she did a really, really bad job in it. And these creatures believed that they were God. So they started creating, and they created human beings, Adam and Eve. And then this female instructing principal felt really guilty because she saw how badly the Archons were treating humans, and she decided to intervene. So in today's story, she comes down and she takes the form of a serpent and she speaks to Eve. And she said, the ones who created you, whom you call gods, in fact they're just the Archons, they're not really God. The ones who created you, what did they say to you about those two trees? And Eve said, they told us we're not allowed to touch them or else we will die. And she says, not true at all. If you eat the fruit of those, you'll be gods like them. Your eyes will open. You'll be able to distinguish between good and evil. And the other tree is the tree of life. And then she disappears. Meanwhile, the Archons come back and they realize something has happened. So they set a test for Adam and Eve to find out if their eyes have really been opened. They parade all the creatures of the earth in front of them and said, what's that? And Adam says, that's an elephant. What's that? That's a rhinoceros. What's that? That's a hippopotamus. What's that? That's Kathleen Lyons. And they can name them all accurately, which proves that their eyes have been opened. So it's not that God allowed us to name the creatures. He was testing us to know if we knew what the creatures were. Now, there were three different kinds of human beings emerged then according to the story. These Archons mated with Eve, and they produced Cain. Adam mated with Eve, and he produced Abel. And then God mated with Eve and produced Seth. So there are three kinds of human beings. There are the evil ones that came from the spawn of, like Cain, that came from the spawn of the Archons. And there are just ordinary human beings, like Abel, that came from Adam and Eve mating. And then there were sons of God, what you hear in the Gnostic scriptures as the truly human beings. These are beings that come directly from God. But much more importantly, there are three different kinds of spirituality. There's the spirituality of, raw power, religion, wanting power. And there's the spirituality of kind of secularism, represented by Abel. And then there's the spirituality of real, deep, mystical thinking, represented by Seth. So there was the story of the Archons that was read this morning. Which brings me to the final piece of it. The guide then according to Jesus. So Jesus is commenting on some of these texts, but it's very hard for us to get it. So Jesus is saying, for instance, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, you scholars and theologians, because you've locked the room of knowledge and you've thrown away the key. You won't go in there yourselves, and you forbid those who want to from going in. So what is he talking about? He's talking about a form of religion that's been shored up by theologians and scriptural traditions and ecclesiastical organizations for millennia, not just the Christian churches, but others, where you're hiding the secret knowledge. So much so that even the priests don't have access to it anymore or don't believe it anymore, and we're trading instead in just dogma. And Christ says, woe to you. You've locked up the room, you've thrown away the key, you won't go in there yourselves, and you forbid those who want to from entering. And so what's in there? It's mystical spirituality. But instead of mystical spirituality, we're given just secular religion, or power-based organizational dogmatic religion. And Christ is really upset with this. And so he says, there is a vine which has been planted apart from the Father. And because it has no root, it'll be taken up and it will perish and go away. So what is that? That is religion that's only based on organization and dogma. It is a vine that has been planted apart from the Father. But the Father himself, or the Mother herself, has planted a different vine. It is the vine of deep, mystical spirituality. And that is the vine that produces the fruit, ultimately. And that was the job of Jesus. Jesus came, it seemed to me, to tell us that all of these alleged covenants between Yahweh or between these demigods who are constantly fighting with each other and enjoining their members to commit genocide against other nations and destroy the other nations, this cannot be God. These are merely the Archons. Gods don't make covenants with particular nations. Maybe the Anunnaki did, or maybe the Archons can, but the ultimate source does not make covenants with individual nations and prefer them over others. For source, there's only one reality, and it's the reality of love. And so when Jesus asks, what is the greatest commandment of them all? He'll go straight to source. It is not covenants. It is not agreements of any kind. It is not 613 precepts. It's to love God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind, because God is love. And to love your neighbor as yourself, because your neighbor is God. So if you really want to do a tremendous mitzvah, a great service to yourself, and a great service to our world right now, keep God growing.